Chapter 1. The Hardest Things to Say. Some things are very hard to say. These are the most important things. When you try to say them, they feel smaller than they are in your heart. You feel shy or afraid. People might not understand. They may even laugh or look at you strangely. I was 12, almost 13, when I saw a dead body for the first time. It happened in 1960, a long time ago, but sometimes it feels like yesterday, especially at night, when I dream about him. I see the hailstones falling into his open eyes. Then I wake up, shaking. Chapter 2. The Treehouse Gang. My friends and I had a treehouse in Castle Rock. It was our secret club. We played cards, smoked stolen cigarettes, and hid magazines. The roof was metal we took from the dump, but we had to be careful. The dump manager had a scary dog. That summer was the hottest in years. One morning, Chris, Teddy, and I were in the treehouse, complaining about school. Teddy laughed in his strange way, ee, like nails on a board. Teddy was different. His glasses made him look older, and he couldn't hear well. His father, a war veteran, had burned his ears on a hot stove. Teddy still loved him, even though he was sent to a hospital for crazy soldiers. Teddy was also the wildest. He took dangerous dares and ran in front of cars, jumping away at the last second. Suddenly, we heard someone climbing the ladder. It was Vern, out of breath. "Can you camp out tonight?" he asked. "Maybe," Chris said. "My dad's drunk again." "You have to," Vern insisted. He looked excited. "So, what's this about?" Teddy asked. Vern took a deep breath. "You guys want to see a dead body?" We all froze. Chapter 3. The Forests of Maine. We had heard about the missing boy on the radio. His name was Ray Brower, and he was from Chamberlain, a town 40 miles away. He had gone to pick wild fruit but never came back. The police searched for days, but they couldn't find him. We all knew he was dead. In those days, Maine was full of deep forests. There were no big roads or buildings like today. If someone got lost in the woods, they could disappear forever. Vern had heard his brother Billy talking about the body. Billy and his friend Charlie had taken a stolen car to the back Harlow Road. There, they saw something near the railway tracks. A dead boy. Billy and Charlie were scared. They didn't tell the police because they had stolen a car. They decided to keep quiet. But Vern, hiding under his house, heard everything. Now he was telling us. We sat in the treehouse, shocked. "We can find the body first," Chris said. "Then we tell the police. We'll be famous." "But what if Billy finds out?" Vern worried. "He won't care once the police know," I said. We planned to camp out at Vern's house as an excuse. If our parents called each other, they wouldn't find out we had left. None of us came from rich families, and some of our houses didn't even have a telephone. Chris's dad was always drunk. Vern's dad worked at a factory. Teddy's mom rented rooms to strangers. My parents had never been the same after my brother Denny died. They barely noticed me anymore. Chris sighed. "John and Marty are still out of town, so it's just us. We were too excited to play cards anymore." We left the treehouse to get ready for our adventure. Chapter 4. A jar of pennies. Vern had been digging under his house that morning. 4 years ago, when he was 8, he had buried a jar of pennies there while playing a game about robbers hiding their treasure. Later, he lost the map, and his mother accidentally burned it while cleaning his room. Ever since, he had been searching for the pennies, even though we all believed his brother Billy had already stolen them. But Vern refused to ask Billy, afraid he would just laugh and say, "Of course I took them, stupid." That day, while Vern was digging, he suddenly heard the screen door open and shut above him. He stayed quiet and listened. It was Billy and his friend Charlie Hogan. Their voices sounded serious. "Man, what are we gonna do?" Charlie asked. "Nothing," Billy said. "That's what we're gonna do." "Nothing." Charlie sounded worried. "But you saw him. That must be the kid from the radio, Brower or something. The train must have hit him." Vern's heart started beating fast. "Yeah," Billy agreed. "And you puked. Good thing the girls didn't see it." Charlie groaned. "Man, I threw up on my new shoes. But Billy, it's a problem. We can't tell anyone. The cops will ask how we got to Back Harlow Road, and we stole a car." Billy sounded sure. "No way we can say anything. No one will ever know." They finished their cigarettes and left. As soon as Vern was sure they were gone, he ran all the way to our treehouse to tell us what he had heard. Chapter 5. Making Plans. "You're lucky they didn't catch you listening," I told Vern. Teddy nodded. "I know that road. It ends at the river. I used to go fishing there." "But could the kid have walked all the way from Chamberlain to Harlow?" I asked. "If he followed the railway tracks, yeah," Chris said. "Then a train came and bang." "Do you want to go see him?" Vern asked excitedly. Chris threw down his cards. "Hell yes! If we find the body first and report it, we'll be famous." "But what if Billy finds out?" Vern asked nervously. "He won't care once the police know," I said. "What about our parents?" Teddy asked. "We'll say we got bored and camped in the forest instead," I said. "When we find the body, everyone will be too excited to punish us." For dinner, we planned to lie to our parents, saying we were eating at each other's houses. It was risky, but it would work unless our parents talked to each other, which rarely happened. Chris and Vern didn't even have a phone at home. Chris sighed. "John and Marty aren't back yet, so it's just us." We were too excited to play cards. We left the treehouse to prepare for our big adventure. Chapter 6. Brother Denny. When I got home, my mom was out and my dad was watering the garden. "Hey, Dad," I said. "Can I camp in Vern's field tonight with the guys?" "Who's going?" he asked, not really interested. "Vern, Teddy, Chris." Sometimes he complained about my friends, but today he didn't care. "I suppose it's okay," he said. He looked tired and sad. He had been like this since my brother Denny died. Denny, the favorite son. My parents had trouble having kids. After years of trying, Denny was born, their miracle child. 7 years later, I came along, but they never seemed to care about me as much. At dinner, they only talked about Denny. If I said, "Pass the butter," they barely noticed. I felt invisible. Denny was 7 years older than me. We weren't very close, but he was a good brother. Sometimes he took me to the park or read me stories. But mostly, I was alone. That's probably why I started reading a lot and later became a writer. Then, Denny died in an army accident. My parents were never the same. His room stayed untouched, like they were waiting for him to return. I avoided his room. It felt like his ghost was still there, whispering, "Why wasn't it you, Gordy? Why wasn't it you who died?" Chapter 7. The Gun. Gordy's room was hot, but he didn't care. He was too excited about the trip. He rolled up 2 blankets, tied them with a belt, and took his money, less than $1. To avoid his dad, he used the back stairs and walked toward the clubhouse. Chris caught up with him. His eyes were shining. "Gordy, want to see something?" "What?" Chris pulled him into an alley behind 2 shops. The place stank of garbage, but Gordy forgot the smell when Chris pulled out a gun. "Jesus, Chris, where did you get that?" "From my dad's desk." Gordy was shocked. "Your dad's gonna kill you if he finds out." Chris grinned. "He won't notice. He's too drunk." Chris hated alcohol. He had seen what it did to his father and refused to drink, even when others did. "Is it loaded?" Gordy asked. Chris shook his head. "No way." "What do you think I am?" Gordy held the gun. It felt heavy and powerful. He aimed at a trash can and pulled the trigger. K.A. blam, the gun fired. Fire shot from the barrel. His wrist hurt. A big hole appeared in the can. "Jesus!" Gordy screamed. Chris burst out laughing. "You should have seen your face." "You knew it was loaded!" Gordy shouted. Chris still laughed. "I swear I didn't. My dad must have left a bullet in it." Gordy was still shaken, but soon laughed too. At the clubhouse, they reached the clubhouse where Vern and Teddy were waiting. Teddy frowned. "Why do we need a gun?" Chris shrugged. "In case of wild animals, or, it's scary in the woods at night." The others nodded. Even the bravest kids felt scared sometimes. Vern grinned proudly. "I set up a fake tent in my yard with the lights on. It looks like we're there." "That's genius," Gordy said. Chris picked up his backpack. "Let's go." Their adventure had begun. Chapter 8. The Railway. The boys crossed Beeman's Field and reached the railway tracks. The heat was intense, and they took off their shirts, tying them around their waists. They climbed up the railway embankment and looked down the long, shining tracks stretching into the distance. Castle Rock lay behind them, with smoke rising from its factories. "Come on, let's go," Chris said. They walked beside the tracks, kicking up black dust. Vern started singing, but soon stopped. Only Teddy and Chris had brought water bottles, and they all drank from them. "We can refill them at the dump," Gordy said. Chris nodded. "That'll be a good place to rest." Suddenly, Teddy asked about food. They froze. "I didn't bring anything," Chris admitted. "Me neither," Gordy said. "Nothing," Vern added. They put their money together, $2.50. "Not bad," Gordy said. "There's a shop near the dump. One of us can get hamburgers and Cokes." "Who?" Vern asked. "We'll spin coins for it at the dump," Gordy said. As they were tying their shirts back around their waists, Chris suddenly shouted, "Train!" Gordy touched the track. It was shaking. The roar of the train grew louder. Chris and Vern jumped down the embankment, but Teddy stood on the tracks, his glasses flashing in the sun. "Come on, Teddy!" Gordy yelled. "No, I'm going to wait until it's close and then jump." Teddy grinned. "Lorries are nothing, man. This is a train." "You're crazy. Do you want to die?" Gordy shouted. Teddy ignored him and walked into the middle of the tracks. "Just like on the beaches at Normandy," he yelled. Chapter 9. The Dump. The boys reached the town dump around 1:30. A high wire fence surrounded it, with signs warning, "No entry except 4:08 p.m. They climbed the fence and went straight to the water tap. As Vern and Teddy argued over who would drink first, Gordy looked around. The dump was full of old, broken things, stuff America no longer needed. The dump had wild animals, but not the kind in Disney movies. Town dogs came here and fought over rotten meat. But no dog was feared more than Chopper, the dump manager Milo Pressman's guard dog. People said Chopper was trained to bite specific body parts, a leg, an arm, or worse. Even Teddy was afraid of him. Luckily, Milo and Chopper were not there today. Chris and Gordy watched Vern and Teddy at the tap. "Teddy's crazy," Gordy whispered. "I know," Chris said. "He won't live to be twice his age." They talked about an old memory, the time Teddy nearly fell from a tree. A year ago, Chris had saved him by grabbing his hair, holding on even though it hurt his wrist for a week. Chris sighed. "I still dream about it. Sometimes, in the dream, I miss him." For a moment, Gordy and Chris looked at each other, understanding why they were true friends. Chapter 10. Milo and Chopper, the boys rested under a tree at the dump. The shadows grew longer, and they realized someone had to buy food. "The dump opens at 4, Vern said. "I don't want to be here when Milo and Chopper arrive." They decided to spin coins to pick who would go. The first toss landed all tails, which was bad luck. "Nobody believes that garbage," Teddy said. "It's baby stuff. Spin again." The next toss left Gordy as the odd man out. Teddy laughed. "Go get the food, Gordy," Chris added. "We'll wait by the tracks." "You guys better not go on without me," Gordy warned as he left. Gordy ran to the Florida market, feeling the heat of the sun. The journey felt like a memory frozen in time, something he would never forget. After buying food, he hurried back. But as he entered the dump, he noticed something he didn't like. Milo Pressman's car was parked by the office. If Milo saw him, he'd be in trouble. He tried to act calm while walking toward the fence. Just as he was about to make it, a loud voice shouted, "Hey, you! Get away from that fence!" Chapter 11. Night Sweats. After escaping Milo and Chopper, the boys felt victorious. "We showed old Milo we're no pussies," Vern said. "You bet we did," Teddy added. But as they walked, Gordy felt uneasy. Maybe Milo would go to the police. Maybe those 4 tails on the coins were a bad sign. Why were they even doing this? Yet none of them wanted to stop. They reached a railway bridge crossing the river when suddenly Teddy burst into tears. He fell to the ground, shaking uncontrollably. The others didn't know what to do. This wasn't like when you fell off your bike and cried. "Hey, man," Vern started, but he couldn't continue. Chris, the toughest guy in the group, stepped forward. He had a way of calming people down. Listen, Teddy, Chris said gently. Does it matter what a fat old bag of puke like Milo says about your father? Teddy shook his head. It doesn't change anything, does it? Chris continued. Teddy had always believed in his father's war heroism, but hearing someone call him crazy during the daytime in front of his friends made it feel too real. He still fought at Normandy, right? Chris asked. Teddy nodded fiercely. Do you think Milo was at Normandy? No, Teddy snapped. Does he even know your father? No. Talk is cheap, man, Chris said. Milo was just trying to make you mad. He doesn't know anything. Teddy wiped his tears and stood up. He wasn't fully okay, but he wasn't broken either. Chapter 12. The Bridge. The boys reached the Castle River Bridge, a long wooden railway bridge with gaps between the planks, allowing them to see the fast, shallow river below. There were narrow walkways on either side of the tracks, but they were too small. A train's wind could blow them off. Standing at the edge, they all felt fear mixed with the thrill of a big dare. Teddy was excited. This is better than Laurie's, he said. Vern hesitated. What if a train comes? Then we hold on to the wooden supports, Teddy said, climbing over the edge to demonstrate. Seeing him hang over open space, the others felt sick. What if it's a long train? Chris asked. You gonna hang there for 5 minutes? You scared? Teddy grinned. You can take the long way round. I'm going across. They looked at each other. Chris turned to Gordy. I dare you, LeChance. Darers go first, Gordy replied. Chris stepped onto the bridge first, followed by Teddy, then Vern, and finally Gordy. The bridge was terrifying. They had to watch every step. If they misjudged, they could fall 50 feet into the river. Halfway across, Gordy stopped to look up. Chris and Teddy were nearly on the other side. Vern was ahead of him, moving slowly. Then Gordy felt it. He bent down and touched the track. It was shaking hard. A train was coming. Chapter 13. The Loser's Life. The boys walked further into the forest, where the land sloped down into a bog. The air was cooler, but it was filled with huge biting insects. They sat under the trees to drink their cokes. They hadn't been there long when Vern disappeared into the bushes. When he returned, Chris grinned. Train scare you, Vern? Vern shook his head. No, man. I was going to go anyway. Are you sure? Chris teased. Yeah, I had to go, Vern insisted. Chris turned to Gordy. What about you? Were you scared? No way, Gordy said, drinking his coke. Sincerely? Sincerely, man. I wasn't frightened at all. Teddy narrowed his eyes. No, you weren't frightened. Gordy grinned. No, I was a long way past fright. I was into terror. The boys laughed for a long time. Then they lay back, feeling warm and peaceful, just drinking their cokes and enjoying the moment. After a while, Chris stood up. Let's do some walking. It was still bright daylight, but their shadows were growing longer. Gordy looked at his watch. It's after 5. Teddy nodded. Let's make camp before dark. I'm getting hungry. We'll stop at 6:30, Chris promised. Okay with you guys? Chapter 14. Darkness in the Forest. The boys walked one more mile before deciding to camp for the night. There was still some daylight, but no one wanted to go further. They were exhausted, not just from walking, but from what had happened at the dump and the bridge. They were now deep in Harlow's forest, where somewhere lay the dead body of Ray Brower. Nobody wanted to get too close before nightfall. They told themselves that ghosts didn't exist, but keeping 10 miles between them and the body felt like a safe idea just in case. Setting up camp, Vern, Chris, and Teddy collected wood for a fire. Chris made sure it was set on stones with space around it so it wouldn't spread in the dry forest. Gordy sharpened sticks and put hamburger meat on them. When the flames were low and steady, they cooked the meat. They were too hungry to wait, so they ate half-cooked meat, burnt outside, raw inside, but still delicious. After eating, Chris took out cigarettes from his backpack. They laid back, smoking like grown men, feeling good. "There's nothing like a smoke after a meal," Teddy said. "Absolutely," Vern agreed. Nightfall in the forest, they spread their blankets and talked for an hour, discussing fishing, sports, and school. They didn't talk about Ray Brower, but Gordy couldn't stop thinking about him. Darkness came suddenly and completely in the forest. There were no streetlights, no car headlights, and no mothers calling their kids inside. It felt unnatural, like the kind of dark where anything could happen. But instead of feeling scared of Ray Brower's ghost, Gordy felt pity. He imagined the boy lying alone in the dark with flies on his broken body. If a wild animal came to eat him, nobody would stop it. Not his parents, not his friends, not even God. He was dead and completely alone. The thought made Gordy want to cry. Chapter 15. A Dream of Deep Water. Gordy woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first he thought he was in his bedroom, wondering why it was so cold and who had left the windows open. Then he realized the truth. This wasn't his room. He was in the forest. Something held him tightly. Someone else was kneeling beside him, listening. "What's happening?" he asked, confused. The thing holding him whimpered. It sounded like Vern. Now fully awake, Gordy remembered where he was. But why was everyone awake? "Don't let it get me," Vern whispered. "I promise I'll be good." Gordy sat up, feeling frightened. "Chris?" Chris was beside him, listening carefully. "Shut up, Vern. It's nothing." "Oh, yes it is," Teddy said darkly. "It's something." Before Gordy could ask what, a long, chilling scream echoed through the trees. It was high-pitched, like a woman in terrible pain and fear. Vern tightened his grip on Gordy. "Oh, Jesus," he whispered, nearly crying. Teddy whispered, "It's Brower. His ghost is out walking in the forest." Vern panicked. "Oh, God. I promise I won't steal magazines anymore. I'll eat my vegetables. I won't swear." Chris tried to stay calm, but even his voice shook a little. "It's a bird, right?" Gordy asked. Chris hesitated. "No, at least, I don't think so. My dad says wild cats scream like hell sometimes. It sounds like a woman, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Gordy agreed. Chris frowned. But no woman could scream that loud. Could she, Gordy? Teddy, still believing in ghosts, whispered, "It's him. I'm going to go and look for it." Chapter 16. The boys slept deeply, But Gordy kept waking up, hearing birds, mice, and insects. There were no more screams. At 4:45 a.m., he woke up again. The sky was lightening, and the night's fear faded away. Gordy walked to the tracks and sat, tossing small stones. The morning was beautiful and quiet. Then, he saw something move. A deer stood on the tracks, just 10 yards away. Gordy froze, his heart pounding. The deer looked at him calmly, tilting its head curiously. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, without fear, the deer turned, found grass, and started eating. As if Gordy wasn't even there. He couldn't believe it. Suddenly, the tracks shook. A train was coming. The deer lifted its head, hesitated, then leaped into the forest, disappearing with only the snap of a branch. Even as the train's whistle filled the air, Gordy kept thinking about her. Back at camp, he never told the others. It was his secret, his moment, a memory he would keep forever. Chapter 17. Leeches. The boys walked through the thick forest, sweating under the burning sun. Insects bit their skin, and they were exhausted. But the excitement of finding the body kept them going. At 9:30, they reached a deep pool fed by a small stream. "Do you think it's deep enough to swim?" Vern asked. "Only one way to find out," Teddy said. Chris ran down the bank, pulling off his shoes and shirt, and dived in. "It's great!" he shouted. Vern and Teddy jumped in too. Gordy followed, enjoying the cool water on his hot skin. For a while, they laughed and splashed each other, finally feeling happy and refreshed. Then Chris screamed, "Leeches!" Teddy pulled them off his bare body, shouting in disgust. Vern swam to the edge and climbed out, his face pale. Gordy felt cold as he saw black leeches stuck to his arms and chest. He ripped them off one by one. Chris turned around. "Gordy, are there any more on me?" Gordy gasped. 5 or 6 leeches crawled down Chris's back like black buttons. He yanked them off. Then Gordy touched his ear and felt something big. A huge leech had crawled inside his ear. Panicked, he grabbed it and pulled. It burst in his fingers and his own blood ran down his face. Gordy couldn't stop the tears. Dressed again, they all stood in silence, shaken. Then, without a word, they climbed back up to the tracks and continued walking. Chapter 18. Short shadows, dusty shoes. The boys walked on, thinking they were close to the body, but the journey was longer than expected. They had thought the Royal River was only 10 miles away, but the curving railway tracks made the journey 16 miles instead. By midday, Chris realized the truth. He climbed a tall tree, looked around, and told the others, "We won't reach the river until 4 in the afternoon, if we move fast." "Jesus," Teddy swore. "What do we do now?" They were hungry, tired, and dirty. The adventure was becoming hard work. Their parents might be looking for them, and the police might be involved. They had planned to hitchhike back, but it would be dark soon, and no one would pick up 4 dirty boys in the middle of nowhere. Finally, Chris said, "It's still closer if we keep going. Let's move." He turned and started walking, his dusty shoes kicking up black dust. A few seconds later, the rest silently followed. Chapter 19. A serious matter. As they kept walking, Gordy started thinking, why had they chosen the railway tracks? There had been an easier way. They could have hitchhiked or taken a shorter road. Maybe they knew deep inside that finding a dead body was serious. It shouldn't be quick or easy. It should be something difficult, something that mattered. They had joked and laughed at first, but now the moment was real. They were just kids, but they were about to see death up close. And later, Gordy often wondered, if they had taken the easier way, would things have turned out differently? Would Chris, Teddy, and Vern still be alive? Because in the end, only one of them survived. Gordy, now 34 years old, looking back on a moment that had changed everything. Chapter 20. The Body. By 2 p.m., dark storm clouds gathered in the sky. At first, the boys ignored them, but the air felt different. The birds screamed, and the sky turned purple. It had been hot and dry for weeks, so they didn't believe it would rain. But something about this storm felt strange. By 3 p.m., the first lightning bolt struck. The boys saw the Royal River ahead, shining between the trees. Chris shouted excitedly, "That's it! We're here!" They picked up their pace, suddenly full of nervous energy. The body had to be close now. As they moved forward, the storm grew wilder. Suddenly, a fireball of blue-white lightning rolled along the railway track, crackling like an angry cat. It rushed past them, lighting up their faces for a split second, and then vanished into thin air. Teddy, suddenly uneasy, whispered, "What am I doing here?" Chris laughed, though there was a slight edge to his voice. "Man, it's gonna rain like never before." They kept walking, but now the storm wasn't their only concern. Something worse was waiting ahead. Chapter 21. Ace Merrill. The boys stood staring at Ray Brower's body when a voice called out, "What have we got here?" They turned in shock. Ace Merrill, Eyeball Chambers, and their gang, Charlie, Billy, Jack, and Fuzzy, stood at the edge of the trees. Ace grinned. "Well, well, look what we have here." Chris stepped forward. "Go away, Rich. We found him first." Eyeball smirked. "We're reporting him, not you." Gordy clenched his fists. "No, you're not." Ace laughed. "Oh, yeah? Who's stopping us?" Billy turned to Vern. "You little worm! You were under the house, weren't you?" Vern looked terrified. Teddy stepped forward. "Come on, then! Let's fight!" Ace raised a hand, stopping his gang. "There are more of us, and we're bigger. Walk away." Gordy's heart pounded. They had come too far to give up. "What do you say, Gordy?" Ace mocked. "Your brother had brains, do you?" Gordy snapped. "Go to hell, Ace." Ace's face darkened. "Fine, then we'll hurt you, and we'll take the body anyway." His gang stepped forward. The boys braced for a fight. Then, kiblam! A gunshot echoed through the rain. Chapter 22. Hailstones. Chris held the gun, staring at Ace. Ace tried to act calm, but there was fear in his eyes. "You know what happens now?" Ace asked. Chris didn't blink. "No, I don't." Eyeball shouted. "You're going to the hospital." Chris smirked. "Kiss my ass." Eyeball lunged forward. Bang! Chris fired into the water. Eyeball jumped back, cursing. Ace clenched his jaw. Now what? Now you leave, Chris said, nudging Ray Brower's body with his foot. Ace gave a slow, dangerous smile. We'll get you later, Chambers. Chris stayed firm. Maybe, but not today. Suddenly, the storm exploded. The wind howled, and huge hailstones fell, hitting trees, the ground, and Ray Brower's lifeless face. Vern screamed and ran. Teddy hesitated, then followed. Ace stood his ground, watching Chris. Chris's voice shook slightly. Go away, Ace. Ace didn't move. Chris raised the gun. Go! Ace stepped back, glaring, then turned and walked away. His gang followed. Chris and Gordy stood still, hail piling around their feet, listening to engines starting. Chris whispered, We did it! But as they looked down, a chill ran through them. Ray Brower's eyes had filled with hailstones, like frozen tears. Chapter 23. A 20-year-old Dream. Chris sat alone in the mud, shaking with sobs. No one had ever seen him cry before. After a while, Gordy climbed the railway bank and sat on the tracks. Teddy and Vern followed, leaving Chris by himself. 20 minutes later, Chris joined them. He was covered in mud, his face still tense. He sighed deeply. You're right, Gordy. He doesn't belong to anyone. No one spoke. Gordy suddenly had a thought. What if Ace's gang called the police? He hurried back to the boggy ground, searching the grass. What are you doing? Teddy asked. Chris pointed to a spot. Try there. Gordy dug through the mud and found both gun cartridges. He handed them to Chris, who nodded and pushed them into his pocket. Chris stood up. Now we go. Teddy hesitated. No, man. I want to take him. Chris shook his head. We could get in serious trouble. If those guys lie, they could say we killed him. Teddy fell silent. Chris explained the new plan. They would walk fast back to the bridge, then leave the tracks and come into Castle Rock from another direction. If anyone asked, they would say they had been camping on Brickyard Hill and got lost. Milo Pressman knows better, Gordy said. Chris smirked. We'll say he scared us, so we went up Brickyard instead. Everyone nodded. The rain had stopped, and the birds sang madly, enjoying the fresh air. As if pulled by invisible strings, the boys turned one last time to look at Ray Brower. Chapter 24. Love Has Teeth. The boys reached Castle Rock just after 5 a.m. on Sunday morning. They had walked all night, their feet aching and their stomachs empty. They crossed the bridge, passed through the dump, with no sign of Milo Pressman or Chopper, and finally stood in front of their treehouse. None of them wanted to look at each other. After a long silence, Teddy sighed. See you in school on Wednesday. I think I'll sleep until then. Me too, Vern added. But Billy's going to get me. Chris shrugged. So what? Richie's going to get me, Ace will go after Gordy, and one of the others will get Teddy. But we did it. Yeah, Vern said, but he still looked worried. Vern and Teddy left. Gordy hesitated before heading home. Chris noticed. I'll walk with you. They walked in silence, the town quiet in the early morning. Gordy half expected to see his deer standing at a corner, watching him. Finally, Chris spoke. Vern and Teddy will tell others. Maybe. But not today or tomorrow. Maybe not for years, Gordy replied. Chris looked surprised. At first, they won't know how to say it. Then, it'll start to feel like a dream, and they'll be too embarrassed to talk about it. Eventually, they'll almost forget it ever happened. Chris nodded slowly. You see through people, Gordy. They reached Gordy's street, and he wanted to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. Chris offered his hand. Shake hands, man. Chris, shake. They shook hands. See you, Gordy said. Chris grinned. Not if I see you first. He walked away laughing, as if he wasn't hurting, as if he wasn't covered in insect bites, as if he wasn't going home to a dirty, broken house. Gordy watched him go, knowing that some words never get spoken, because love has teeth, and its wounds never fully heal. Chapter 25. Empty kitchen. Back home, the kitchen was empty. Gordy felt like he had been gone for years. He took off his dirty clothes, washed until his skin hurt, then made himself an enormous breakfast. While he was eating, his mother walked in. Gordon, where have you been? She asked. Camping, he replied. Vern's mom said she would tell you. His mother sighed. She probably told your father. She walked to the cupboard and, after a long silence, said softly, I miss Dennis most in the mornings. Gordy looked up. I always check his room, she continued. But it's always empty. For a moment, Gordy felt like he was invisible. That's terrible, he said. She didn't seem to hear him. He always slept with the curtains open, she murmured. Then she turned and frowned. Gordon, did you say something? Gordy swallowed. Nothing important, Mom? Chapter 26. Some people drown. The story never came out. Ace called the police anonymously, and that's how they found the body. Neither his gang nor ours became heroes. Milo Pressman never said a word. Chris's drunk father hadn't even noticed he was gone. Teddy's mother got worried on the second night and called Vern's mom. But Vern's mom saw the tent lights on and assumed everything was fine. A few weeks later, Gordy was walking home from school when a black Ford stopped in front of him. He knew immediately. It was Ace and Fuzzy. He dropped his books and ran, but they caught him fast. If an old lady hadn't come outside, they might have done worse. As it was, they broke his nose, 2 fingers, and gave him several bruises. Chris's brother beat him worse, breaking his arm in 2 places. Teddy and Vern were hurt too. At school, wild stories spread, but none were true. When their injuries healed, Vern and Teddy drifted away. They found new friends who did whatever they said. They started bringing those new kids to the treehouse, and soon, Chris and Gordy stopped going. By spring 1961, Gordy never went back. Teddy and Vern became just 2 more faces in school. They nodded and said, "Hi." But that was it. It happens. Friends come and go like waiters in a restaurant. But when Gordy thought of his dream, those swollen bodies pulling at his legs, it made sense. Some people drown. It's not fair, but it happens. Chapter 27. Tears for a Friend. Vern died in a house fire in 1966. There had been a big party the night before, and someone fell asleep with a lit cigarette. Maybe Vern himself. Teddy, who had always wanted to join the army, was rejected because of his eyes and ears. He started skipping school, hanging out with bad crowds, and later got a job filling holes in roads. One day, he crashed his car while driving drunk with friends. The car rolled 6 times. No one survived. Chris worked hard in school despite his family's disbelief. He and Gordy studied together, trying to win back years of lost education. Chris graduated and went to university for law. Then, in 1968, Chris was in a restaurant line when 2 men started arguing. Being the peacemaker he had always been, he stepped in, and one of them stabbed him in the throat. Chris died in seconds. Gordy read the news in the paper. He told his wife he was going for a drink, but instead he drove out of town, parked his car, and cried for nearly half an hour.